Welcome to When the Facts Change and my 2025 UK Government Budget Special. Now, back in May 2023, when she was in opposition, Rachel Reeves said this: "Taxes are at a 70-year high. I have no plans to be a big tax-raising Chancellor." Yet in October 2024, last autumn's budget, Labour's first in 14 years, the Chancellor raised taxes by a massive £40 billion, the most punitive tax-raising budget in over 3 decades. Reeves said then and since she was fixing the foundations of the economy. This was a once-in-a-generation tax-raising budget. I won't be coming back for more. And yet now we have this, the 2025 autumn budget from Labour, which has just raised taxes by another £30 billion. That's equivalent to around 4 pence on the basic rate of income tax. So Labour's election manifesto said it would raise taxes by about 8 billion, and yet within 18 months of Labour taking office, we've had tax rises of 40 plus 30, that's 70 billion pounds. That's equivalent to around 9 or 10 pence on the basic rate of income tax.
That does mean that today I am asking everyone to make a contribution.
But Reeves didn't raise the headline rate of income tax, of course, in her budget statement on the 26th of November. Instead, she extended the Tories' original freeze on tax thresholds from 2023 to 2028 for another 3 years until 2031. That will drag another million low-income workers and pensioners into paying income tax. And another 900,000 modest earners like mid-ranking nurses and teachers, they'll be dragged into the higher bracket, so will pay income tax at 40%. This is clearly a Labour budget for Labour MPs. And to pick through it, my guests on When the Facts Change include former Tory Cabinet Minister Sir John Redwood, someone who knows his way not only around the corridors of power, but also business. I'll also be chatting to Christopher Nieper, CEO and owner of textile company David Nieper in Alfreton Derbyshire, for his take on how Rachel Reeves' budget will impact the small and medium-sized enterprises, the lifeblood of the UK economy, and vital if the government's going to get the economic growth it needs to make its budget sums add up. Thanks so much for joining me here on When the Facts Change. Now, with 24 hours or so on from this budget, an awful lot of attention's being focused on financial markets, not just equities, but of course the bond markets, the gilt yield, the cost of UK government borrowing. And in order to discuss all things financial and the link between finance and politics, I'm delighted to be joined by an old friend of mine, Helen Thomas. She's a former Conservative special advisor. She's a trained economist. She's worked in forex markets, and she also runs the consultancy Blond Money. And when we cut to the shot of Helen and I, as we're about to do, you'll see why. Helen Thomas, Mrs. Blond Money, great to have you with us on this first ever When the Facts Change budget special. We are 24 hours or so on from the budget. Some of us were expecting quite a volatile, violent market reaction. Obviously, the bond markets, the 10 and 30-year yields have been a really big story in the run-up to this budget. What is the mood in financial markets at the moment, both in the UK and around the world?
Well, sense of relief. I mean, that often does come after a big event. You get this, traders like to say, buy the rumour, sell the fact. You put on the trade beforehand and then you close it off and it goes the other way. We've obviously got, as you and I are talking now, it's the Thanksgiving holiday, less liquidity around, it's a long weekend. Traders wouldn't tend to want to have a big position over this period as well. And I think effectively the message at the moment has been, give them the benefit of the doubt, the UK government, but that is not going to hold forever. And I want to add one other element to this, which is the wider market context, where there's been quite a significant move recently on expectations of interest rate cuts in America. That has increased, which tends to mean everything looks a bit more benign, bonds are in demand, yields fall. So it kind of, in a sense, has gone as well as it could have done from a market's perspective, short term, for Reeves and Starmer, but absolutely not out of the woods yet, especially as we hear more and more about what has gone into this budget.
Right, before we talk about the budget itself, Helen, let's just talk a little bit about the last 6 months or so leading up to this budget. Now, back at the time of the peak of the panic of the Liz Truss mini budget in October 2022, the 30-year UK gilt yield, obviously a marker of long-term borrowing costs, what financial markets, big institutional investors charge the British government to borrow, that peaked at just below 5% at the height of the Liz Truss mini-budget crisis. Yet we've been way above 5%, getting up to 5.5, 5.6, 5.7 for the whole of this calendar year under Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. Now, gilt yields around the country, around the world, Treasury yields in America, long-term borrowing costs across the G7 have gone up. But in the UK, they've gone up a lot more, haven't they? And the UK does now have, and has had for some time, yields not only a lot higher than under Liz Truss, so markets are more sceptical, if you like, but also they're the highest in the G7.
Yeah, and in fact, I thought quite interesting the OBR themselves referenced that in their annual fiscal risk and sustainability report. Stay with me, don't switch off. It's not as boring as it sounds, because when a body that is very technocratic starts to sound the alarm bells on something like that, you need to sit up and take notice. And Liam, you've been quite clear following this for some time, very sensibly. I think that spread, that difference, that the fact that the moves in the UK, we would call it a high beta. So when you get a move in the US, you get the same in the UK, but by more, is a sense of embedding political volatility into the market. And that makes an awful lot of sense because we are teetering on this huge pile of debt to GDP, massive deficits, one false move and the whole thing can fall down. Frankly, credibility of this government is hanging by a thread in the market and actually with voters as well, which is why it really is, it's Reeves and Starmer are still on that tightrope. They've managed to put another foot in front of the other, live another day, but the tightrope is still very much there. And frankly, more importantly, where was anything about growth in this budget? Even the OBR don't see it increasing growth. So trying to improve that debt to GDP ratio, which you can try and do if you get growth, if the GDP goes up, completely absent. No sign of that in this.
And with growth, you get more tax revenues. With growth, you get fewer people unemployed, fewer people on benefits, and so on. Look, what are we really talking about here? We're talking about the possibility that the UK could go through a 1976 moment. What happened in 1976? The UK had to be bailed out by the International Monetary Fund. It was like our economic Suez. It's when the kind of, the scales fell off our eyes. The UK is no longer an all-conquering global economic powerhouse. Actually, it's bankrupt, or at least it's insolvent. It's got a cash flow problem. There's a danger now, it strikes me, Helen, and not just me, that there's the possibility of a cash flow problem again. That's why yields are so high. That's why markets are demanding, the pension funds, the insurance companies, the big global players that lend governments around the world serious money, they are demanding higher and higher compensation and interest costs to lend to the British government. Now, you will have noticed, and I know financial markets have noticed because people have started to ring me up about it. This borrowing that Reeves announced in her budget on Wednesday, it's all front loaded. So over the next 2 to 3 years, in each year, there's tens of billions of pounds more borrowing in each of those years. And yet she only makes the sums add up because all the tax rises, the pain, like the mansion tax, like the threshold freeze extension, all the rest of it, that only comes in towards the end of the Parliament. So what Reeves is actually saying, which doesn't strike me as credible, is that the pain is going to come nearer the next election. Are Labour really serious about, will they implement these tax rises?
Well, and frankly, Jeremy Hunt actually did something very similar to the tail end of the
Chancellor,
the former Chancellor did that tail end of the last government, and actually the market completely disregarded it because he wasn't going to be in power, so it didn't matter.
Yeah.
I think it was described as a work of fiction. I think the IFS today have said it is a fiscal fiction to expect this. I mean, if I might, for one moment, just I don't want to bore everybody, but this element of the OBR report, which talked about, just one sentence here, the fiscal consolidation starts from a higher borrowing level and is more backloaded, with measures pushing a greater share of the consolidation later in the forecast. That, to me, that one sentence, if I had to pick one thing out of the 203 pages of the OBR, is a red flag to gilt markets, ultimately. I know, as we say, they had a decent relief rally in the short term, but that isn't going away. That's what this budget has delivered.
And for the OBR to write something like that, a kind of finger wagging, a ticking off, if you like, of the government's fiscal plans, that language will have been through many hands. It will have been through many committees. It's not the kind of thing that civil servants usually write. No. And I do think, even as we speak, I've been out and about in the City of London this morning, where I'm recording, the When the Facts Change studios just near the City of London. I've talked to 2 sets of investors already this morning about the budget, got their feedback. There is a growing sense that the way the borrowing is front loaded and the way the pain is end loaded, it would barely be credible with a Tory government that might have a taste for some fiscal consolidation and may be able to sell to its voters in the run up to an election, look, we are doing fiscal consolidation. We are the grown-ups in the room.
Yeah.
The chances of Labour doing that, well, as my old mum would say, there are 2 hopes. There's Bob Hope and there's no hope.
Yeah, she's spot on, isn't she? Actually, you've got to judge the government on what they've done to date, right?
There you
go. They haven't been able to actually do the fiscal consolidation. We started with the welfare reforms that completely fell by the wayside. And
the market noticed those over the summer, didn't they? Very much so.
Agreed. And a key thing we have learned that I think is very important, again, a bit technical, but we have learned over the last few weeks in this whole OBR process, there was the window they took for measuring the market as a snapshot for their models. They used 2 different windows. They used one for the economics forecast and then one a few days later for the fiscal forecast. In that period, gilt yields fell and it made everything look a bit better for the government. Yeah. Now,
the economic forecast is growth. The fiscal forecast is tax and spend and borrowing and headroom and all that malarkey.
Exactly. And if it sounds a bit like sleight of hand, to some degree it is. But what it has revealed to us, because at the time with this whole Rachel Reeves walked everybody up the hill towards she might have to do breaking the pledge and the income tax rises, and then we came back down again because apparently it was all fine. It was supposed to partly be to do with a shift in the forecasts by the OBR, which we now know is actually not really the case. But what we have found from that whole process is there is a level at which this government do not have the political capital to deliver tax rises that are required. They've done something like 88 measures.
Or let alone spending cuts.
Oh, well, I mean, that's off the table. That is just, that just cannot happen. So, and actually what we now know is, roughly speaking, because of where gilt yields have moved, we kind of actually know where in the market that, if you like, almost political doom loop kicks in, because basically should anything happen, it could be external, it need not be UK, but if gilt yields were to rise, there comes a point at which that if you want a response from the government to get debt back on track, frankly we now know it can't be done, certainly not under Reeves and Starmer. They're not strong enough to break these manifesto pledges. Look at where they are in the polls at the moment. They realised they looked at that and they didn't want to take that risk. So we actually, from a market's perspective, we're starting to see the shape of where the risks are building up. Yeah.
Just to sum up, Helen, we've been quite technical. I think we've managed to pitch the conversation at a level where people can follow, but it all sounds a bit arcane, because it is a bit arcane. These are financial markets. But let's just finish by bringing it home to ordinary men and women watching this. They may be in business, they may be employees, certainly they're managing their own household finances. What are the implications going forward of the fact that financial markets are so febrile. The bond market does really have the UK on, gilt spike watch, if you know what I mean. The idea that borrowing costs could shoot up, actually,
and sterling as well, I should mention.
And sterling
could struggle.
Could take a nosedive, and all those things. What are the implications for ordinary people? What are the implications of higher gilt yields as opposed to the Bank of England? Because the Bank of England seems to be lowering interest rates all the time, and yet the market seems to be putting interest rates up.
Well, of course, the big one people feel is mortgages, which are run off 5-year and beyond rates in the market with this yield curve. The Bank of England only set rates overnight. There's a yield curve of where the government borrows over the longer term, so it can affect that. But I think it's more profound than that. And I do think the British public do get it. I think they know it's not working. It's a shambles. There's no good leadership happening here. And therefore, it's all very wobbly. It could fall apart at any minute. And frankly, that is going to harm people's plans for investment, spending, moving house, growing their business, growing their family, growing their lives. I mean, I think they know that this government has a majority but no mandate for what it's doing. Therefore, it's going to have to go at some stage, either a new leader and ultimately a new election. Sadly, that in fact, there's kind of more crisis to come. And I do think British people do actually get that. In fact, I'm going to finish with a message from my friend Ethan, whose nana lives in Sunderland, who's always the bellwether.
A northeastern nana. Get her on When the Facts Change.
We should. She voted Labour her whole life, except she voted to leave and Brexit, and she did vote for Boris. Can't stand Keir Starmer, never has. And she just said to him, "What is this nonsense?" That's what she thought of the budget. What is this nonsense? And I think Thomas, we'll leave you with that.
Mrs. Blond Money, great to have you on, and hope to see you in the future again on When the Facts Change.
Thank you, Liam.
So that's Helen Thomas, who founded the Blond Money consultancy, one of the really respected voices in the City of London, linking politics with finance. And guess what? She's from Blackpool. Yes, really. Moving on, let's talk to somebody who really knows government from the top. Former Cabinet Minister Sir John Redwood, one of the most financially articulate politicians we've had for many years. He's also a financial services professional. He absolutely knows his way around budgets and financial markets. And it's great to have him joining me now here in the When the Facts Change studio. So John Redwood, thanks so much for coming to When the Facts Change studio. We are about 24 hours or so on from the budget. We just had last year a budget that raised taxes by 40 billion. This one raises taxes by around 30 billion. These are historic numbers. We haven't seen anything like this for decades.
No, it's without precedent. They're far too high and they're doing serious damage. And for once, the opposition is making very good points with good advice that the government ought to adopt. And the opposition says, to have a proper budget from here, you start with the spending cuts. The spending is way out of control. And if you did that, then you would have some better options. The government came into office promising a growth strategy, and it now has an anti-growth strategy. It's taxing business out of existence. It's forcing them out of business if they dare to burn energy. It's banning all sorts of our activities, oil and gas, and making of petrol vehicles and so forth. And so it's very difficult to see how they think they're going to get growth whilst they burden us with massive tax rises because they can't run the public services efficiently and well.
To what extent do you think this government is different from the Blair government? You and I met back then. We both watched the Blair government very, very closely. Blair came in with 35% of GDP sovereign debt. Labour came in this time round with 90% of GDP sovereign debt. The size of the majority was similar, 170 or so, and yet Blair got a lot more votes, had a much bigger mandate. Starmer got, just 1 in 5 votes of the electorate. And yet it strikes me the Labour front bench think they can spend like Brown and Blair.
Well, more than Brown and Blair did, because Brown and Blair did decide that they would keep tax rates down to the levels they inherited from a tax-cutting Conservative government, and they kept with that all the way through till the last year when they put them up and duly lost. And this government looked as if it was going to do the same, because it had promised us all no rises in the main taxes that we have to face, and immediately started breaking the promise. And they've now broken the promise on 2 separate occasions. They broke it on national insurance, particularly national insurance on the self-employed, whose tax did go up, and they are working people, one would have thought. And now this time round they're breaking it on income tax by the sneaky way of freezing the thresholds for longer. And of course that's caught them out in their own words, because the Chancellor herself last year at the budget made a thing about saying, well, of course I'm not going to do the sneaky thing of freezing the thresholds. That would be breaking my promise. Now she's broken her promise.
It's picking the pockets of working people. And it strikes me, 24 hours or so on from the budget, we can make these kind of points. The fact that if you lower a national insurance threshold to £5,000, then that really hurts lower income workers the most. It's the part-time workers that become proportionately more expensive. And if you freeze a tax threshold, again, it's regressive. It's anti lower income people, because it costs lower income people more proportionately than if you take the garish headlines of having an actual income tax rate rise.
Well, indeed, because it's going to drag hundreds of thousands of people into paying 20% tax where they don't pay any tax at all at the moment. Worse still, it's so negative for young people. They think they're doing them a favour by upping the minimum wage for them, but they've already put this massive tax on jobs, making businesses more sceptical about offering vacancies to young people. With the extra increase in the wages, many businesses will say, well, we'd like to, but we can't afford it. And they're going to have fewer staff, and they're going to have more people with more experience because they're more productive. And so it's dreadful for the young people, and yet Labour want us to believe that they're on the side of the young.
In this current fiscal year, John, and for the next 2 years, we now know that borrowing is projected to be much higher than it was before this budget. Borrowing this year, the forecast has gone up by 21 billion. That's the equivalent of 3p on the basic rate of income tax for the whole year. In the next fiscal year, up by 15 billion compared to before the budget. And in the year after that, up by 18 billion. So in the rest of the Parliament, the extra borrowing is very front-loaded, but the tax pain is back-loaded towards the end of the Parliament. Now, with the day after the budget, I've been in the City of London just down the road this morning talking to 2 sets of investors before we started this conversation. I started recording this show. There is a sense that this kind of backloading of the pain, but the forward-loading of the borrowing could well unravel, not least because a Labour government is even less likely than a Tory government to impose any fiscal pain just before an election. What do you make of that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think the numbers aren't credible. I mean, it's worse than you're saying, because the big tax increases actually kick in after any conceivable date for the next election. So they're prejudging what a future government will do when it looks as if they're going to be thrown out of office because they are so unpopular. The total deficit means that they're going to have to borrow £628 billion more over the 5 years if they did run the whole.
Just mind-boggling numbers.
I know. And then because there's so much debt that's about to mature that we have to pay off, they've got to borrow to pay that old debt off. So in total, they're saying to the bond market, we want to raise 1,300 billion over the 5 years.
1.3 trillion.
1.3 trillion over the 5 years. And she says, I'm getting the debt down. No, you're not. You're putting it up.
So why are the markets calm? These are the big institutional investors around the world, a world that we both know well. You've got a distinguished career in financial services. You've set up asset management companies. I've been involved with asset management companies too. We know what these markets are like. Why are they calm a day or two after the budget? What's going on?
Well, they haven't been very calm about this government, and so I don't want to trouble the debt markets at all. The cheaper we can borrow, the better it's going to be for the sake of our economic recovery. But remember that we're having to pay a lot more than the Europeans on the continent. All the major countries there borrow at 1 or 2% less. And we're borrowing at a dearer rate now than the Americans, whereas we used to borrow at a very similar rate.
And a much dearer rate than during the Liz Truss mini-budget crisis.
All this year, this government has had to pay more than the worst day, which was just a one-day under Liz Truss. So they are being charged an enormous, I think they call it an idiot premium. That people don't trust.
I think the technical term's moron premium, John.
Well, I'm trying to be polite. But it is something we are having to pay. And it's doubly worrying because you pay the higher rate on all the new borrowings, that's 628 billion they want to borrow over a full 5 years from here. But you also have to pay it on the old borrowings, because a lot of that old borrowing was borrowed 5 or 10 years ago when interest rates were near zero. And so that's going to come in at a much higher interest charge as well. So Rachel Reeves rightly constantly tells us and her colleagues that paying over 100 billion a year of interest on debt, which is what they're doing,
twice what we spend on defence,
is unacceptable.
More than we spend on schools.
And it must crowd
immoral.
It crowds out decent spending. But far from dealing with that problem, the combination of wanting to borrow an awful lot more and of having to repay debt and borrow debt in its place at these higher interest rates means that we are going to be absolutely scorched. It's going to go way over 100 billion, much of it thanks to Rachel Reeves failing to control spending and borrowing on her watch, and therefore meaning we had to pay more to re-borrow the money we'd already borrowed. I'm
just going to push back a little bit there, not to blame you, but just because you are a senior member of the Conservative Party. And then I want to move on to the fact that you were very much around in the early days of Thatcher, and the comparison between today and the mid-1970s. I think that's a particularly fascinating aspect of your experience and your contributions to the national debate, John. But before we get to that, look, when Ken Clarke was Chancellor, when Ken Clarke ceased to be Chancellor, when Brown and Blair came in, the national debt was 35% of GDP. They were bequeathed to the Tories a pretty difficult inheritance. The national debt was 90% of GDP. The tax burden was already at a 70-year high. Yes, we'd had COVID, but also during the so-called austerity years between 2010 and 2019 under the Tories, yes, there were some controls on public spending. Even the Lib Dems had to suck those up during the coalition years of 2010 to 2015. But John Redwood, and you and I talked a lot about it at the time, the national debt as a share of GDP, even during those austerity years, went up 2.5 times. I would say, to be fair, Rachel Reeves took on a pretty tough inheritance from the Tories, in contrast to Gordon Brown back in '97. But she's made it a lot worse with her spending decisions. Well, I would say she knew the inheritance because all these numbers were public knowledge, and you and I and others have been talking about them for many years. And yes, everything she has done has made it worse by not getting a grip on spending and allowing borrowing to surge in this ridiculous way. And of course, she loosened the controls over all that. Her new so-called fiscal rules allowed her to borrow a bit more. And then she did that and more besides, which is why she then got the penal interest rates and why we've had all these difficult conversations. Now, the Conservatives did spend and borrow too much in their years in office. They did some very good things before 2019 and the COVID attack hitting them a year later. For example, got the civil service numbers well down. They've surged since, partly because of COVID and now with this government continuing to recruit. So the public sector has got a lot less productive than it was at the best point before COVID under the Conservatives. And the Conservatives were starting welfare reform, and they had a bit better control over the welfare budget than this government has done. This government comes in knowing the last government had all sorts of plans to control welfare, and it does the reverse. It decides that it's going to grant more and higher benefits to all sorts of people. And as a result, they have a massive welfare overspend. And they're also going to find that it's going to get more difficult to get people into work, both because they're creating unemployment by stalling growth, and because it's less worthwhile working. Now, you were around in politics in the mid-70s, if I may say so, as a very young man. Young man, very precocious, Oxford academic. You came into politics. You've obviously got a lot of experience in business too. But let's just talk a little bit about that time, what it was like, because it's not 1997, it's actually 1975. I think we're on the cusp of some kind of financial crisis. Of course, we had that in 1976. What was the atmosphere like within the Conservative Party? What are the lessons that your current leader, with whom I know you're on good terms with her, I know you're admirer of her, what can she learn from that period? What can your party learn from that period? And what difference, John, does reform make?
Well, what she is learning from that period is that a Conservative government was discredited by its inability to run the economy and control inflation in the early 1970s and was thrown out of office.
Under Heath,
and Labour took over. But they immediately set about making the problems worse, and they did exactly what this government's doing, spending too much, borrowing too much, believing the markets wouldn't have their revenge. And the markets had a very savage revenge on that government.
In 1976, under Callaghan and Dennis
it meant
Healey.
that we had to have the humiliation of our country going off to the IMF, normally a place to lend to poor countries in really serious trouble, and a major advanced country that should be supplying the money to the IMF was suddenly having to borrow because, of course, the pound fell very sharply, and they decided they needed to do something about that. We don't at the moment have a problem with the valuation of our currency. We have a question about what price we're going to have to pay to borrow all this money, and that is why the leader of the opposition is very wisely saying, don't take the risk. She's set out, uncharacteristically for an opposition leader, 47 billion of quite detailed areas where she would cut spending immediately. Brave thing to do.
Because in opposition, people just promise the earth.
Because why
yes,
would
of
you
course,
do that?
yeah,
Because most people don't, on the whole, like cuts.
That's
but
right.
I think it shows just how serious the problem is that the public actually supports that measure by a bigger margin than oppose it. And it also shows that so much of the expenditure now is on things that people don't want or is wasted. So it actually makes the task this time around of cutting public expenditure considerably easier than it was in 1979 when Margaret Thatcher came in.
For instance, reimposing the two-child cap on child benefit. It's a very popular policy, believe it or not.
Well, it's a very good policy because it's saying to people it must be worthwhile to go to work, and given that people on low incomes, well, I think apparently everybody has to make very careful decisions about how many children they can handle and they can afford. Why do you take some of that pressure off people on benefits and make the people on low income employment pay for you to not have the same problem? So I think that is a popular policy, and there are quite a lot of other popular policies. I think, for example, the very good work that Ian Duncan Smith and the CSJ have done on how you get people back
Former
into
Tory
work.
leader, of course.
Yes, working with charities, working in the field on how this can be improved has shown that if you've got mild mental health conditions, particularly young people, helping them into a job is often the way over that. It's part of the cure, it's not part of the problem. And this government has suddenly granted sick notes for life to tens of thousands more people than the old government was doing, and quite a lot of those are young people with mild mental health issues which could be sorted out whilst at the same time helping them get a job.
So what should Kemi do now, and how should she deal with reform? What would be your tactics, John?
Well, I think she's doing fine, and she's had a lot of parliamentary successes recently. I mean, the timing of the attack on Mandelson, where that was a disgrace which embarrassed Britain with our leading ally at a very sensitive time, and then the work she's done on expenditure and the benefits crisis, and then the attack she launched on the Chancellor and the state of the economy. That was absolutely brilliant. It was the best performance by a leader of the opposition against a budget I've ever seen, and I've seen a good few.
You certainly have, even though you're a relatively young man, of course. And finally, John, so what would you say to those people? We all know who they are. Those people in your party who continue to plot against her. How would the public, how would the world react if the Tories ended up with, say, 6 leaders in 6 years, which is what it would be? There's a lot of talk in your party, and it's not just idle chatter. Very serious people who've got all kinds of comms teams in place and are making little videos and spreading them all over the place. After the local elections next May, where the Tories are likely to get a kicking in Wales, in Scotland, in some of the local council elections. A lot of people want to change leader then. What would you say to them?
Well, I say to them publicly as I do privately, don't do it. It would be crazy to do this. Kemi Badenoch is doing extremely well. It's a very difficult job. The first part of it has been done partly by Labour itself. The first part of the job of the opposition is to show people that the current government is a disaster. Well, that's happened and she's helped that, but particularly because of the actions of the Labour government. The second part is to show you can be trusted to do better. That's going to take time. She's moving in the right direction on all of that. If we then indulged ourselves in thinking somebody could do it better, I think the public would just sigh and say, there you are, these people aren't serious, we're not going to bother with all that. The new party that's going to spend its time arguing about changing leader is, of course, the Labour Party, because they are desperately unhappy with their current leadership. And they don't think the Chancellor's doing a good job, but if the Chancellor went, it probably wouldn't be long before the Prime Minister went as well.
So John Wood, thanks for now. I'm going to come back to you and we're going to talk more about small businesses. You have launched businesses yourself. You're very much a commercial practitioner as well as a leading politician. But I will come back to you because we're now going to go over to Alfreton in Derbyshire, a company called David Nieper, a very well-known company locally, a big local employer in that small Derbyshire town. It makes women's textiles, and we're going to talk to the CEO of David Nieper, who's called Christopher Nieper, and let's talk to him now. Christopher Nieper, great to have you with us here on When the Facts Change. Before we get going, tell viewers a little bit about your business, about David Nieper, about the fact you're a family firm, you're in a small town in a very beautiful part of Derbyshire, but tell us about the importance of your business, your towns, your local community, and what the local community means to you.
That's fine. Thank you very much, Liam, for inviting me today. It's a great pleasure to be with you. And you are absolutely right. We are in a small town. We're in Alfreton in Derbyshire. It is a former coal mining town, actually. And when I started my career, there were coal mines here, and most of the men were employed in the mines and most of the women were employed in textiles. Of course, the mines have all gone and nearly all the textiles have gone to the Far East. And we are one of very few companies to have stayed loyal to local people for well over 60 years. We've never gone offshore in search of cheap labour. We've just invested in local talent all the way through. Now, that's why we're here. And about 7-8 years ago, I realised that our workforce was getting older and older, and we really had to either go offshore ourselves or we had to invest all over again in the next generation. And so we worked with a local school. We went and looked at local schools to see if it was possible for us to work with them to get employability skills into young people, because very few people at that age were wanting to get involved in manufacturing or textiles, which they saw perhaps as a sunset type of industry. And it turned out that the local school in our town was not just the worst school in Derbyshire, but it was in the bottom 2% of all English schools. And it had had 6 head teachers in 6 years. And it had lost its sixth form entirely, and it was about a quarter full. Well, we sponsored the school in its entirety, and I formed a trust. And we found a new head teacher, and I bought a new uniform for every single child. And we renamed the school and moved into a new building. And within 3 years, the intake had tripled and it became oversubscribed for the first time in 20 years. And today it's the 3rd most oversubscribed school in Derbyshire. And what I'm most proud of is that every single pupil or student leaving our 6th form has secured a job or an apprenticeship or a place at university. And that's really a valuable outcome, I think, for a forgotten town. And
these are the so-called academy reforms, aren't they, for viewers and listeners who aren't in the UK and aren't familiar? And over the years, a number of leading industrialists and indeed family firms have sponsored local schools, have helped to remake and revitalise local schools, to put something back into the community. But also, David, let's be clear, to provide a seedbed of good young talent some of whom can work at David Nieper?
Ultimately, yes. But the point of having a good education and giving young people a good academic education with good vocational skills and good employability skills is you lift the whole economy from within the town. We're not relying on government handouts. Frankly, we can't wait for government. This has been going on for decades. We can't wait for them. So this is about generating skills, unlocking talent, unlocking the animal spirits of people within the town to create economic growth in a sustainable way with local people. And so it's not just education, by the way, we also need opportunity. So we need to link them together with opportunity, and we need to showcase good examples of businesses, good examples of what's happening in the schools, in the council, in the church, in the leisure centre, so that people feel a belonging to the community. So we put that together as well, actually, in a local media that we run, which is for the community, by the community. And I think that three-pronged approach of a good education, opportunity for work, and the community spirit is what will drive the economy from inside.
I did want to dwell on that because I do think it's an unheralded aspect of what's going on in the UK at the moment. You have lots of SMEs and local family-run firms in many of our towns, as opposed to our cities, that are of enormous importance to the local community and have been literally for generations. I think JCB, on a slightly bigger scale to you with respect, is very, very similar. Not a million miles away from Derbyshire there in Staffordshire. And there are other shining examples around the country of people like you, enlightened industrialists, if you like. So, Christopher, it's, your company, you do high-end women's fashion or mid-market to high-end. You sell in all kinds of ways, not least by old-style catalogues. You're a very successful business. You make garments also for some of our leading high street brands and so on. I've had the pleasure to visit your factory over the years and meet some of your workforce, and I know you've put a lot of effort and time into lobbying ministers how to deal with so-called NEETs, young people not in education, employment or training. So against that backdrop, as a communitarian minded, profit-making, successful business, the importance of your business goes way beyond your own balance sheet. I think that's completely unanswerably true. What do you think of the budget? What's going on among SMEs across the UK, the small and medium-sized enterprises that I personally want to champion, coming from an SME background myself, but I think which all sensible politicians understand are vital to the lifeblood of our economy and our communities?
You're absolutely right about that, and thank you for mentioning that we are a fashion business. I forgot to say that we are sewing, we are printing, we are knitting garments, and that fashion textile sector is one of the worst hit actually over the last 30 years. Hit as in going offshore, particularly to the Far East in search of cheap labour. So thank you for saying that the value of this business within the town, and what I was really hoping for in the budget was something which would unlock the talent of British people. And, I think we have over 9 million working age people at the moment in this country who are not working. And almost 1 million of those are in this young 16 to 24 age group, which is 1 in 8 of our young population. And you're right, they call them NEETs, not in employment, education or training. And if these young people don't get a job soon, then we are seriously going to damage their future careers. And towns like Alfreton, who are already left behind, will become even more left behind. I must say, I've had the privilege of meeting Rachel Reeves. She was kind enough actually to come to Alfreton over the summer, and she was very receptive. I think she really does want to do the right thing. She was receptive to what's going on here. And she's produced two policies in the budget which attempt, shall we say, to address this NEET problem. But I'm afraid I don't think they really go quite far enough. And the two are the Youth Guarantee and the Growth and Skills Levy. Now, the Youth Guarantee is an idea where somebody who's been unemployed for 18 months, which I think is quite a long time, will be guaranteed a job of 25 hours a week for 6 months. I'm not quite sure how they're going to guarantee a job for these people and who's going to take them on, because I don't think it's that attractive for us to take on someone who's been unemployed for 18 months. And I think it's a huge pity to let young people rot for 18 months before we get them into work. And the proposal, which she didn't pick up this time, but maybe she will in the future, or the government will in the future, is to give businesses like us an incentive to hire young people directly as they come out of education, as they come out of school, college or university. And instead of the government having to subsidise 100% of the wages of these 18-month unemployed people, I was proposing much less than that, perhaps 40% or 50%, provided the employer puts them on an apprenticeship, which gives them a life skill and a transferable skill, which they can use elsewhere. And I think that that would save the government a lot of money, because then they're not drawing on the welfare system either, and you don't get the social scarring. Now, the other scheme, Liam, I've actually got some figures for you here, the growth and skills levy. And what the government has announced in the budget is that they will fully fund apprenticeships. Is that right? They'll fully fund apprenticeships for SMEs. Well, they're already 95% funding them for SMEs at the moment. So there's only a difference of £500. There's only a difference of 5% in that. Now, the £500 figure applies to us because we train sewing machinists and we train garment makers, and that's a level 2 or a level 3 apprenticeship. A level 3 apprenticeship, we have some funding for delivering that apprenticeship of £10,000. So we're going to get 5% of that, which will be £500, which is over 2 years, which is £250. So they're going to give us £250 a year to train a level 3 apprentice. But on the other hand,
it's a drop in a bucket.
they've now put up the national living wage by £1,982 for an 18-year-old. So they give us £250 and they take away £1,982. So if we were not keen to take on young people before, we're even less keen now. And I think that's a great shame. And by the way, I don't think we'd even get the £250 because they don't classify us as an SME either, because our payroll is over the 3 million threshold. So we wouldn't even get the £250. So instead, we just have to suffer £1,982 per year, per person extra, more than what we did before the budget. And I think it's a great shame, because I would love to see the budget being a very people first. Let's get the economy going by unlocking the animal spirits of people, of business, of entrepreneurs, and getting the economy going through talent. That's what I was hoping for. So there we are, Liam. That's my view.
I know you've been putting this proposal forward for a number of years, and fair play to you, Christopher. And I know you try and engage in a modest way with policymakers, and you try and influence outcomes. Again, not necessarily to the benefit solely of your business, but to the benefit of your community. More generally speaking, as an SME business owner, as somebody that talks to lots of other SME business owners, what's your sense out there of the economic mood? We hear that business sentiment is low. We read business surveys from the Institute of Directors, British Chamber of Commerce and others that talk about plunging sentiment. How does it feel where you are? Because unless we can get growth going, Christopher, unless we can get the economy moving, none of the Chancellor's sums have got a hope of adding up.
No, they haven't, unfortunately. It's a pity that there's a stigma now attached to hiring young people, and an even greater risk with their first day rights, etc. There is a gloom, there is a malaise in the economy. It's very difficult for us to invest in the future, to invest in new machinery, new equipment, new premises, new advertising, invest in AI, invest in marketing. We really are just sort of living day to day without the confidence of that. And I think that's happening not just in the UK, it's happening elsewhere as well. In a way, the weaker the pound gets, the better it is for us to export. But I just wish we could have a stronger, more positive vibes coming for the UK economy. I would love that to happen.
And finally, Christopher, tell us about the Employment Rights Act, as it will be. It's still a bill. It's still going through Parliament. It's ping-ponging between the House of Lords and the House of Commons. This is the kind of back to 70s Tribute Act legislation that gives trade unions a lot more rights, that gives workers rights to unfair dismissal and all kinds of other benefits from employers from day one of employment. Potentially a lot of employers will be worried about vexatious claims. Obviously, lots of workers and potential workers are good, decent people. This is the UK. Most people are good, decent people, but there will always be some vexatious employees chancing their arm, trying their luck, pushing the burden of their household costs onto unwitting businesses. What do you think of this incoming legislation, and what do your fellow commercial business owners think of it in your experience?
I think we wish it wouldn't happen. It's a pity. You're absolutely right. It's important that people having a new job feel secure and feel valued and appreciated and safe in their company. But it's also important, it's a balance really, for the company to feel safe to take a risk. And it is a risk to take on a new person. And we are not, the kind of employer who takes advantage of staff. We've been here for 60 years. The average length of service of our staff is nearly 11 years, which is more than 3 times the national average. We really do look after our people as well as we can. We look after their children. We look after them after they've retired. And it's a pity for us to be penalised because there may be some unscrupulous employers elsewhere. And I wish they wouldn't do this. At a time like this, when we are on a knife edge of trying to get the economy to grow, I think we could do without this headwind. That's a pity.
Christopher Nieper, Alfreton's finest, of David Nieper. Thanks a lot for joining me on When the Facts Change.
Thank you, Liam.
So that was Christopher Nieper of David Nieper Textiles in Derbyshire. He always speaks sense. One of the local employers in towns around the UK that I think are really suffering, have suffered for years, and I think they're particularly suffering now with increases in the minimum wage. They're suffering with all kinds of other regulations and onerous conditions placed on SMEs. And never forget that SMEs employ getting on for 2/3 of our workforce, and they generate at least half of our GDP. So John Redwood, thanks for staying with me. You understand small businesses to your fingertips, not just as a politician, but also as somebody who's actually built and set up businesses.
Yes, indeed. And you're absolutely right. And your lead interviewee is absolutely right, that in order to make it more likely that you can set it up and grow it successfully, you need fewer regulations and you need a light tax burden, because you need to generate the cash yourself to invest in the business. You start off with an unprofitable business and you have to grow it quickly, otherwise the losses start to overwhelm you. But if you've got the government campaigning against you at the same time, makes it even more likely your business won't succeed.
I tell you what really does concern me. Now, we know, because we've had lots of farming protests, we know that the farmers, family farms, the inheritance tax rules are being changed. The threshold only goes up to $1 million, and above that you pay 20%. And on a family farm, the land's worth a lot of money, but of course there's not much cash. A lot of those farms are going to get taken over by big corporations, big corporate landowners. And you and I, we're free market people, we're pro-business people, but that can't be a good thing. That can't be a good thing. Similarly, with lots of family-run SMEs, SMEs that have often been around in towns for 1, 2, 3 generations, the same rules are going to apply when you're passing on a family-run business. You're going to have to get you'll get a massive tax bill because of the removal of what we call business property relief as opposed to agricultural property relief. This second one, BPR, hasn't really been featured much in the press, but I know that so many small business owners across the country are desperately worried they're going to end up, when the principal owner passes away or retires, rather than passing the business on, they're just going to sell, aren't they? They're going to sell to private equity firms who are going to asset strip the business, take the database, take the customer base, less competition, less tax revenue for the UK exchequer, and crucially, less local employment, particularly in the regions.
No, you're absolutely right. And one of the things that Margaret Thatcher agreed to do when she came into office, inheriting a very weak economy shattered by the financial crash of the mid-70s, was to put in a set of policies that enabled more people to work for themselves, to set up a business, to grow a small business without the same tax and regulatory burden. That worked extremely well. And these small businesses are very likely to be the innovators, the pioneers, the people who produce the new challenge, that develop the new idea. And they're also usually very good members of the local community, because they give back to the local community, because they're trying to nurse the local community and persuade them to be good customers. So you lose a lot socially and economically if you hammer the small businesses. And if you decide at the beginning that if they're successful, you're going to tax them too much, you know what? Some people won't bother. Or more importantly now, a lot of our young talent is going to somewhere like Dubai and saying, look, I can set up a business in Dubai just as easily as I can in the United Kingdom. And if I succeed, they take a half or a quarter of the amount in tax that the UK is.
And it's not just the financial high rollers, it's people setting up, hairdressing salons, nail bars, poodle grooming businesses in Dubai rather than in the towns of the UK, and that's a terrible thing.
But it is. And also when you're starting up a business, you want to do all the best things for your customers, and you want to concentrate on sales and marketing and making sure the service and the product is right and everything is working safely. And instead, you're burdened with this enormous number of requirements from planning authorities and tax authorities and all the rest of it. And so you spend a lot of your money on getting advice on making sure that you stick by all the regulations. And if you have too much of that, there's not enough money left over to grow the business.
I think SMEs and people who work for SMEs and people who run SMEs, they really are the battleground of the next general election. It strikes me there's no one on the Labour front bench that's ever set up or run a business. There's lots of public sector people. Again, what do you think your party should be doing or saying to these people? How about this, right? If I was the Chancellor, I would say we are going to do an immediate, when we come into office, if I was the Shadow Chancellor, we are going to do an immediate cut in corporation tax for SMEs from 25 back to 19%. Because that corporation tax, it's not just paid by, city high rollers, it's paid by plumbers, sole traders, it's paid by all kinds of people, not of huge wealth. What do you think of that idea? And then with a view to lowering corporation tax overall, because we know from George Osborne cutting corporation tax from 27 to 19 between 2010 and 2019, we got more tax revenue from a lower corporation tax rate, not just in pounds and pence, but as a share of GDP as well. Shouldn't the Tories be saying something along those lines?
Well, maybe they will. I mean, I think they're right to study it and think about it. And we're unfortunately quite a long way from a general election. So Mel Stride, I'm sure, has tax cuts in mind, but he will want to plan those properly, and they've got to be affordable. Like you, I actually think that if we were bold enough to cut corporation tax rates, we would get more money in.
Yeah.
And I always advise George Osborne and his successors to do the thing properly and go for 15% or 12.5%.
Even if you get there iteratively.
When that's where I'd have gone there in one go.
The whole way.
Because I was always pointing out to them that the Republic of Ireland, with a tax rate much lower than ours, collects 4 times as much revenue per head from business than we do. They've taken an awful lot of big investments from America that might well have come to Britain if we'd had the same corporation tax rate. I think we just missed a golden opportunity. And it's proof of the point you and I believe, which is the lower the tax rate on something like business, the more you're going to collect up to a certain point, obviously.
You know what else I'd do? I would say that we're going to raise the VAT threshold from 82 grand or whatever it is at the moment up to 150 grand. Because what so often happens is you get sole traders and they'll get to like 70 or 80,000 pounds of revenue. Of course, from that they'll be paying for materials. They're not massive earners. They'll be paying for assistants, other people. And then it gets to January, so 3 months left of the financial year, and they stop working because they don't want to pop the VAT threshold, because then suddenly they're liable for massive amounts of VAT. So
no, you're spot on, and I've met businesses that are literally like that they close for.
You can't get a plumber in
January, February, or whatever.
Yeah.
Because they don't want the extra turnover.
That's right.
And they're the decent legal ones. Other people might actually
just
be,
into the black economy, if you like.
Doing what you don't want them to be doing. So yes, you need to do that. I've always been an advocate of a much higher VAT threshold, and the Treasury have always disagreed. Jeremy Hunt eventually gave in and just sneaked it up a little bit, but I, like you, wanted to do something more dramatic. And the counter argument is they say, well, it gives the smaller companies an unfair advantage, and then there's a step when they do grow up. But don't you want them to have a bit of a counter advantage?
Of course
the big companies have got all sorts of other big advantages that they're using. And given what I've already said, that the smaller businesses are likely to produce the innovations, the breakthroughs, the exciting new developments, they'll drive the improvement in quality that the big companies will have to catch up with. So you want to give them a bit of a help.
So John Redwood, it's great to have you here on the show. Thanks so much for coming into the When the Facts Change studio. So that's it, folks, from my very first When the Facts Change show. It's been about the UK's November 2025 budget. I hope you've got something out of it. I hope you've enjoyed it. Spread the word. I'm going to be doing more of these shows. And in the meantime, thanks for joining me.
Well, and Liam, congratulations on launching it. Every success. I want you to be a small business that gets bigger.
Cheers.
Thanks for joining When the Facts Change, economics and politics in a fast-moving world with me, Liam Halligan. Please subscribe to my When the Facts Change YouTube channel and my podcast via Spotify, the podcast app, or wherever you listen. And above all, please subscribe to my When the Facts Change Substack for more of my interviews and writing.